When Russia started their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there were approximately 7 million young men living in the country. Now, a little bit over 3 years later, there are only around 6 million young men living within the country, a reduction of about 1 million, or 15% over the course of 3 years, from a number that was already drastically too small. These young men have been lost for obvious reasons. Some have been lost to the war. More have been lost to immigration as they leave the country. But in either case, Russia has lost a huge portion of the young men that they needed to run their economy. And it's actually even worse, because there are a lot of young men who have gone to the war in Ukraine who have become casualties and have been, unfortunately, disabled in combat, which means that these people, from a purely financial pension standpoint, when it comes to a demographic problem, will now be net drawers from social support rather than net contributors, which, from a purely financial standpoint, Russia already had a big problem with to begin with. When looking at the situation alongside Russia's existing problems with a declining birth rate and a missing generation of men, a lot of sociologists have concluded that within 6 to 10 years, Russia will completely lose its ability to conduct military offensives. Because as we know, Russia's preferred strategy for military offensives is to use a large number of ill-equipped people to rush objectives against opponents that are technologically superior. Russia will soon lose its ability to do this, and that could be a big reason as to why Russia is fighting its war against Ukraine now and is refusing to quit. They want to push forward at any cost because, from the crude math of a dictator, they want to use the young men while they have them, because in 6 to 10 years, they will not have young men to throw at the objective. In the mind of a dictator, a lost young man, whether he is lost on the battlefield or just simply doesn't exist due to a declining birth rate, is all the same when they are looking at these people merely as tools to achieve an objective. Bluntly stated, Russia's population is shrinking. Actually, it's collapsing. And the overall population is collapsing at the same time that there are more older people entering retirement age in Russian society due to increased longevity due to medicine and things like that. At the same time that more people in Russia are retiring and who will draw from Russia's pension system, there are fewer young people in Russia to actually work and produce incomes that will feed into that pension system. And all these stats together shows you the direction that Russia is going. The work behind this episode and several other episodes that I've been able to research and publish for free was made possible by my sponsor, Incogni. If you're like me, you're sick of spam calls, junk mail, and people selling your data. Incogni helps address the source of a lot of these junk messages, which is data brokers. These data brokers are in the business of collecting and selling your personal details. They can have all sorts of information, like your name, your address, your phone number, and often even your online browsing habits, which they then sell to anyone willing to pay. Marketers, background check sites, employers, landlords, or even health insurance companies looking to raise rates based on online browsing activity. So imagine if you were turned down for a job or a rental, or had to pay more for health insurance, all because someone purchased information about you that may have been outdated or incorrect. Incogni helps put a stop to this by removing your data from hundreds of data broker websites, a process that might otherwise take you hundreds of hours to complete on your own. All you have to do is sign up, give Incogni permission to act on your behalf, and they get right to work, finding, flagging, and demanding that your information be deleted. As someone with a large following with a lot of people who want my personal information, I have definitely gotten a lot of value by using data broker removal services. So I definitely recommend you check this out for yourself. And if you want to, you can use my code Warburg to get a massive 60% off an annual plan. So just scan the QR code on screen or follow the link in the description. And again, use the code Warburg to get 60% off an annual plan. For Russia, World War II led to some good things and some very, very bad things. And the worst thing that happened to Russia, arguably, at least as far as it extends into the modern day, is what is called the missing generation. The generation of people that every 20 years or so should technically exist, but doesn't. Because the people who would have been their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents died in World War II and never gave birth to their children. In Russia in 1923, if you were a boy that was born that year, the year that would have brought you into fighting age around the time of World War II, you only had a 20% chance of surviving to your 23rd birthday. Or in other words, only 1 in 5 boys that were born in Russia in 1923 were still alive in 1946. This was for a lot of reasons. Of course, the war, famine, disease. But this arguably created ripple effects across Russian society that still exist to this very day, not just in terms of the lost generation, but in terms of social cohesion and what a missing generation of men does to a society. In Russia, even to this day, men have a very low life expectancy, and that's not even factoring in the war in Ukraine. Even leading up to the war in Ukraine, when Russia had no major catastrophic wars that took out a huge percentage of their population, their men had a very low life expectancy. And a lot of sociologists would say that this is in part due to rampant alcoholism. Actually, it's indisputable that it's due to rampant alcoholism, but they will say that the rampant alcoholism is in part due to this missing generation of men, which leads to a lot of boys growing up also without fathers. And when you grow up without a father, that leads to certain social trends that can amplify with each generation. And it can actually take 3 or 4 generations for those effects to be reversed, even if you are moving on a good trajectory. And Russia hasn't been moving on a good trajectory because this missing generation of men, causes a lot of this to repeat every 20 years or so. This contributes heavily to what even Vladimir Putin himself has acknowledged is Russia's biggest problem, which is Russia's demographic problem, which includes this missing generation of men, but is not exclusive to it. There are other problems that in some ways are equally as large that feed into this. This means that Russia is declining in a way that is indisputable and that precedes even their war against Ukraine. All of these problems that I'm discussing existed in Russia long before they invaded Ukraine and have only been made worse by the war in Ukraine, exponentially so. Some even argue that this problem is a partial cause for the war in Ukraine, with Russia trying to turn its attention outwards to address the growing social uncertainty within their own country by assigning blame to somebody other than themselves. But in either case, it does mean that regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine, whether Russia wins that war or loses, as seems more likely, Russia's state of decline is still going to continue, and in a generation or two, Russia will no longer be recognizable as the world power it is today. The reason Russia has such a big problem right now is because of 3 main factors. The first, I've already mentioned, which is a declining birth rate. The second is an increasing death rate. And the third is net immigration, where more Russians want to leave Russia than people from other countries want to come into Russia. It is really the combination of the 3 factors that makes the crisis for Russia so extreme. When, for example, you look at the United States also has a very low birth rate, below replacement level. But the United States experiences a lot of immigration, which in the case of the United States is a good thing because it prevents the country from reaching the point where they have more pensioners than they have workers who are able to contribute to the system. In Russia's case, this is not so, and the system gets progressively more and more overloaded from a demographic perspective with each passing year. For a birth rate to be considered at replacement level, or rather fertility rate is the proper term, it needs to sit at approximately 2.1 births per woman, because that woman has to replace herself her husband and account for the unfortunate event where many people die before they give birth to their own children. In Russia, the birth rate, though, is not around 2.1, but instead is currently around 1.5. So from the beginning, Russia is not putting enough new people into their society. The Russian government definitely acknowledges this and has tried to do so in a lot of strange ways, which actually, funnily enough, are now being repeated in the United States as of just a couple weeks before I filmed this video, where Russia is trying to incentivize women to have more children through financial incentives and social programs. Basically, they try to encourage childbirth across the nation socially, and they try to encourage women to give birth to more children by having financial incentives. That, of course, doesn't necessarily work because the government, if they give you a pretty low sum, let's just say $5,000, that is not enough for a mother who otherwise would not have given birth to decide, hey, I'm going to go have a kid just so I can get $5,000, because, of course, raising a child costs far more money and far more effort than that. Instead, the reason for a declining birth rate, there are several, but usually it is a social degradation where people do not feel as well off as their parents were, and so they themselves do not want to bring more children into that world, or they feel like they have to work harder before they're at a financial level where they feel capable of taking care of a child. And so they delay giving birth to children until they're older, and that causes them to have less children overall. Whatever the case, Russia has been desperately trying to address their low birth rate, but they have been unsuccessful, or at best only marginally successful, and they are far from solving their problem. For the death rate, Russia has another problem, a high death rate, particularly among young men who die at twice the rate of Europeans. In fact, in Russia, young men are expected to live about 6 years less than somebody who lives in Bangladesh, which is famously an extremely poverty-stricken nation that is also stricken by heavy natural disasters, flooding, hurricanes, things like that. Russian men have an average life expectancy of around 68 years old. And for Russia, this is a problem, because unlike the birth rate, they aren't really doing anything to address the death rate. Obviously, pursuing a war against Ukraine is not doing them any favors, but there's another reason the death rate in Russia is so high, and it's actually the primary reason I've already mentioned, which is alcoholism. And in Russia, there is a long history with alcoholism that gives the Russian state little incentive to actually reverse this. Alcohol is used as a form of control in Russia. It's a way for the Russian state to keep people at the lower rungs of society happier so that they don't rebel against the nation. And that's a tradition that has gone back to the early days of the Russian Empire, where one of the only mass-produced items in the Russian Empire was vodka that the Tsar, the state, subsidized to ensure that all the peasants could afford it, so that they would be in a constant state of drunkenness. Russia has tried to reverse that trend in society, even by banning alcohol, but every time they get a new leader who wants to be despotic, like Vladimir Putin, those trends get reversed, even though Vladimir Putin doesn't drink himself. He has a brand of vodka called Putinka vodka. It's a whole crazy situation. In Russia, the vodka bottles, in fact, are designed with a cap that cannot be resealed because the expectation is that you will consume all of that vodka in one sitting. So this rampant alcoholism, which is increasing the death rate in Russia, Russia as a state has no real incentive to help solve that problem because they actually see it as a benefit, and arguably it is something that they do on purpose. With all of this in mind, Russia's only real hope is migration, convincing people from other countries to come into their society to boost their population levels. And this is a really tough sell for Russia, because Russia is an ethnic monoculture. In Russia, some 72% or so of the entire population is considered ethnic Russian. This is a major deterrent to immigration to Russia because people typically don't want to immigrate to a country where they will be seen very clearly as an outsider. People, when they are immigrating to a country, it is already an uncomfortable situation where they are in a place that is not their homeland, where they don't know the customs. I mean, they may not know the language. They certainly don't know the culture. And the way Russia is designed amplifies those problems instead of solving them. Because of that, Russia has a huge immigration problem. In fact, if you dive into Russian political rhetoric, you will find a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric that is very similar to what you will find, for example, in the United States against immigrants that are coming over the southern border from Mexico, where Russians are very concerned in particular about Chinese immigrants immigrating over the border from China into Siberia because they are afraid of China basically culturally replacing them and then maybe even changing the borders over time, doing kind of what Russia does, getting a lot of ethnic Chinese in the area and then declaring that they need to invade to protect them, kind of like what Russia did to Georgia and kind of like what Russia did to Ukraine. And this doesn't help Russia's immigration problem either because it explicitly kind of attacks the main population of people that actually might be interested in immigrating to Russia and populating some of its unpopulated areas. So for all these reasons and more, there are obvious incentives for people to not want to come into Russia. And at the same time, there are also obvious incentives for people to want to leave Russia. A big reason they lost so many young people after invading Ukraine. A lot of Russians are leaving the country. And in particular, these are obviously Russians with passports. In Russian society, not everybody has a passport. Typically speaking, if you have a passport, you are tending to be more educated. You are tending to be what is considered a first-class Russian citizen, somebody who's actually contributing to the economy and likely lives in the heartland, one of the main cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. And so what we're seeing is a lot of people leaving Russian society, and it's the ones that are the best equipped to help Russia face the problems that they're going to face in the future. This is called a brain drain. It's nothing new in Russian history. They experienced a massive brain drain after the Soviet Union collapsed, and a lot of people who finally had the freedom to leave the country did so. And now they're experiencing a massive brain drain because of the war in Ukraine and all the effects surrounding it. But of course, it was even happening prior to that too. So the net that we see is a population crisis in Russia that over the next couple generations is essentially going to delete a large percentage of the Russian population. This is happening for a lot of reasons. The birth rate is too low as it is. The death rate is increasing, and that's causing people to die before they can have children, especially because of the war in Ukraine. They have net migration of the people with skills and education leaving the country, not being replaced by enough immigrants, and even the immigrants that do come into the country typically don't have the level of education and skills as those leaving because they're typically coming from Central Asia. They're lower skilled and they're just looking for any opportunity that they can find. This is obviously a massive problem for Russia, and it means that the good news is I probably won't be making videos about Russia for the rest of my life. They are very quickly going to become sort of irrelevant on the world stage. What will be concerning is how that happens and what happens in the process of that. We're already seeing that today with Russia's war against Ukraine, which a lot of analysts have connected to Russia's demographic problem in several different ways. Some people say maybe Putin's goal was to give up on solving the demographic problem through the strategies he had tried, and to instead just try to capture Ukraine to solve the demographic problem. Maybe the idea was to absorb Ukraine into the Russian Empire and thereby boost Russian population numbers and improve the demography, at least on paper, in terms of raw population. I don't necessarily buy that explanation, because to me, when I examine the psychology of Vladimir Putin, this does not seem like the kind of guy who would go into war and risk potentially losing his power to improve demography. Instead, I see Vladimir Putin as the kind of guy who would risk making an existing demographic problem, an existing population problem, even worse in order to gain power. So my theory, if this is all connected, is that Putin is attacking Ukraine now in a sort of use them while you got them mentality, a sort of last-ditch effort to use Russia's demography while he can to capture a portion of Ukraine. A final explanation might also make sense. For years, Russia's demographic problem, its population collapse, has been widely publicized within Russia itself. And the government has been unsuccessful at solving the problem. Putin's government. It is possible, then, that in attacking Ukraine, he is trying to distract from his failures at home and what has been the biggest domestic issue at home by pitting the people against an external opponent. That is very plausible, and it could be a combination of several of these factors. So looking at all of this, what can we learn? I think one of the most important lessons we can learn is that when we are having social problems within our own countries, we need to be very alert and very careful that politicians don't come in and start directing our attention towards external opponents and trying to make us angry at them for all of the perceived problems in our society. It could very well be a tactic that they are using to not solve the problem, but to just allow themselves to remain in power a little bit longer. Now that's why I do what I do on this channel, so that when these types of things happen, I am analyzing them from the ground up to see if the words of the politicians match the reality. If you've appreciated that work, before you go, if I could ask for a quick favor, if you want to support the channel, you can become a patron. It's completely voluntary. It's just a way to support the work I do on this channel if you want to. You can scan the QR code on screen to learn more, or follow the link in the description of this video. With that in mind, that's all for this one. I'll see you on the next one.